Hello and welcome to Local Nation. On today's episode, if you're having redistricting problems, I feel bad for you, son. We've got 99 assemblies because Nebraska's got one. We're talking about state legislatures today. Like I've said in past episodes, the Constitution doesn't say anything about towns, cities, or counties. When it comes to the rules for how cities should function or how we divide up county lines, the states decide. But more specifically, the lawmaking branch of each state decides. That branch is usually called the General Assembly, or just the legislature. I'll use the word legislature most of the time on today's episode, because it just drips off the tongue, doesn't it? Legislature. That's going to be a lot of fun to say. Anyway, so legislatures are basically the legal motherships for counties, cities, and towns. States are responsible for the education, health, and welfare of their citizens. They need to administer a court system, maintain state roads, and regulate commerce within the state. Legislatures pass laws on those topics, and the governor and executive branch put them into action. State legislatures also have to pass an annual budget to pay for all of those things, and that in itself ends up taking a lot of their time. Every 10 years, legislatures draw up districts to ensure fair representation in Congress. Or sometimes, they just draw ridiculous shapes that look like antlers and snakes to make sure their party stays in power. So why should you care about your state legislature? I get it. There are tweet bombs coming out of the White House every night at 3 a.m. You're hustling for a promotion at work. Your parents want to know when you're coming to visit, and you're fighting with the city about a pothole on your street that could swallow a small car. So what's the big deal with state legislatures? Honestly, you're nowhere near the only person asking that question. If I'm being honest, until I started researching this episode, I only had sort of a vague answer myself. I definitely didn't feel the urgency to stay on top of state happenings. I've come around on that for 3 big reasons. So here we go. Let me see if I can convince you. Number 1, state legislatures draw the lines every 10 years for both state districts and U.S. congressional districts. That gives them big influence over the balance of power in Congress. Republicans caught on to this way ahead of Democrats. Back in 2008, they got out in front with a strategy to swing state-level races in key areas. Their playbook could be summed up really simply. Flip as many state houses as possible in 2010, draw maps favorable to Republicans so it's easier to elect more of them to the U.S. House in 2012, and also make it easier to win even more state seats in 2014. So if you care about national politics, you need to watch the states. Number 2, the states are way more productive than Congress, at least if we're measuring productivity in terms of bills passed. In 2016, the U.S. Congress passed fewer than 200 bills. Granted, some of those were omnibus bills, but compare that to Tennessee. In the same year, Tennessee's upper and lower houses passed over 3,000 bills. A lot of those were probably just incremental housekeeping bills, adjustments to old laws that flew through both houses, or resolutions to name bridges after some local hero. State legislators love naming things. But in between those routine bills, states also pass laws that can have a big impact on your daily life. Bills on immigration, education, state minimum wage, workplace discrimination, the opioid crisis, and land and water conservation. Plus, state laws can have a domino effect on other states. Often, that's intentionally accelerated by third-party groups. Republicans are also out way ahead of Democrats on this strategy, with powerful groups like the conservative American Legislative Exchange Council, or ALEC, drafting model legislation on topics like illegal immigration and privatized education, then socializing it quickly among the states. And of course, all of this productivity can move federal policy too. If the tide starts shifting among the states, Congress might feel pressure to take action. Or states reach too far. This has happened in everything from Jim Crow to bans on gay marriage. And then those states get sued for violating the Constitution. If that fight goes up to the Supreme Court, their ruling could set a national precedent. The third and final reason gets us back to local government. States set the boundaries for localities and manage the purse strings for special governments like school districts. When Obama signed the Every Student Succeeds Act, that education initiative held on to the federal accountability of the Bush-era No Child Left Behind plan, but it also gave states a lot more autonomy in how they set goals for public education. Same deal with Obamacare. When Congress passed that, it left a lot of discretion to the states. Sometimes lawmakers have even weighed in on who should or should not be in a bathroom. You may have heard about North Carolina's 2016 bathroom bill. That bill said that if you were going to use a bathroom in a government building, the stick figure on the door had to match the gender listed on your birth certificate. That completely dismissed the idea of gender fluidity and had queer and transgender communities and allies fuming. The legislature actually eventually repealed that bill a year later, but the repealing bill also added a provision barring local governments in North Carolina from setting their own non-discrimination laws related to private employment or public accommodations. So, there you go. There are at least 3 reasons you should care about the states. 1, they're swinging congressional elections. 2, they're way more productive than Congress. And 3, they hold the keys to local funding and autonomy. Okay, let's talk some quick nuts and bolts here. 49 state legislatures have both an upper and a lower house. They're what's called bicameral. Legislators inside the lower houses are typically referred to as state representatives. The upper houses sometimes call their members state senators. Generally speaking, all state legislators have 3 primary jobs: making laws, oversight of the executive branch to make sure they're implementing those laws, and representing the interests of the state's citizens. Mostly we're going to focus on that first job, lawmaking, since it takes up a big chunk of their time and is one of the ways they also represent citizens. Those of you familiar with the Schoolhouse Rock classic I'm Just a Bill will be relieved to hear that the process of making a law is very similar in state legislatures. You'll also be relieved to hear that I'm not going to be doing any singing. So lawmakers or groups of lawmakers sponsor a first draft of a bill. Maybe this is prompted by requests from their constituents, or it's in response to some disaster, or it's one of those model bills making its way around states. Or maybe they just had one of those "there ought to be a law" moments and then thought to themselves, "Oh, right, that's my job, I'll make a law." However it gets made, that first draft gets filed with the House clerk and added to the agenda for a first reading on the floor. They don't read the whole draft, just a brief title description. That first reading magically transforms a draft into a real bill with a magical name like HB 2560. At this point, the bill gets referred to a standing committee for deliberation. Houses might have anywhere from 10 to 30 standing committees framed up around topics like education, health, and agriculture. Committees help break up the workload. They also allow legislators to develop some specialized knowledge and create opportunities for leadership as a committee chair. Mundane bills will probably get referred to the committee closest to their subject matter. A bill to amend a rule about fishing licenses, for example, will probably end up with, no big surprise here, the Game and Fisheries Committee. But for a politically charged bill, committee referral can be a very dangerous moment. When legislators eventually vote on the floor for a bill, they'll usually follow the recommendation of the committee. A receptive committee could come back with a recommendation to amend or pass, in which case that bill is off to the races. It's likely to pass on the floor. Committees can also submit a recommendation of do not pass. Though in most houses, if they want to kill a bill, they'll usually just recommend to hold it in committee. Putting a hold on a bill is a little passive-aggressive, but it gets the job done. Typically, the Speaker of the House or head legislator makes the call on where a bill lands. He or she quarterbacks the bill. That speaker is usually part of the majority party, which can make it tough for controversial bills from the minority party to get off the ground. Some states put the decision in the hands of a committee, as sort of committee on committees. A few actually let the bill author decide where it should go, and that can lead to some weird placements, like an education bill getting pushed to the Agriculture Committee because that committee happens to be stocked with party cronies who will give it a recommendation to pass. But for a bill to officially pass, the Speaker needs to bring it to the floor for another reading, debate, and vote. These days, speakers, along with lobbyists and other legislators, pretty much know where the votes stand before they bring a bill to the floor. And for that reason, many speakers won't bring a bill to the floor unless they know it has a chance to pass. Most houses require a simple majority of those present to pass a bill. Now, if a bill makes it through all that, it has to go through the same gauntlet in the other house before it lands on the governor's desk to be signed, or vetoed. All that work and one stroke of the governor's pen can make or break it. A veto is a political stand by a governor, and it's not without its own risks. Legislators can also override a veto, but that requires typically a 2/3 vote from both chambers. That's a tough trick to pull off, so it rarely happens. One of the goals of a state legislature is to try to balance power with the governor, but no one ever said that'd be easy. If you find this whole process maddeningly inefficient, you're right. Legislators sometimes invest tons of energy in a bill only to see it put in committee purgatory, squashed on the floor, or torched by a veto. And largely, that's the point. The structure is designed to slow things down. It's also an attempt to solve a classic dilemma called a collective action problem. A collective action problem looks like this. Legislators know they can only get a bill through by working together and trading some political capital. But they also have competing priorities. They want a cut of that budget. And they also know that the wrong compromise could upset their district and put a target on their back when election time rolls around back home. Ideally, a big house gives representatives some cover to negotiate. The institution needs to pull all of this off while trying to meet a few other goals. They need to stay responsive, representative, and accountable to their constituents, and pass laws that serve citizens. Subtle differences in the rules, leadership structure, length of sessions, compensation, staffing, and the size of the district each member represents can make a legislature more or less transparent, more or less accessible, and more or less susceptible to corruption. Even location can make a difference. In 2014, 2 researchers from Harvard's Kennedy School found that more isolated state capitals, that's capitals farther from major population centers like cities, those capitals saw a higher number of federal corruption convictions. Before we wrap up the nuts and bolts section here, we should say something about the state legislature that broke the mold. Every family has one crazy uncle, and Nebraska is America's crazy uncle. Nebraska's legislature is unique for a couple of reasons. First, since 1937, it's been unicameral. 49 senators come together in a single body under one roof. It's also nonpartisan. Nebraskans believe that a single house saves taxpayers money and that it's more accessible and more accountable to the electorate because it's just so simple. Nebraskans don't have to remember their state rep and senator, they just have one name to remember per district. But many argue that Nebraska's unique legislature is only possible because of Nebraska's unique situation. Nebraska has a pretty small population, and it gets away with paying legislators less compared to other states. They also point out that Nebraska didn't really have a history of entrenched party caucuses before they switched to the nonpartisan unicameral. So who's right here? Well, maybe no one. In 2015, the Center for Public Integrity graded and ranked the states based on laws and systems that they have in place to deter corruption. Nebraska's unicameral got a D+, which sounds pretty bad, and, is. But that D+ was also good enough to put them in 9th place out of 50 states. In fact, only 3 states, Alaska, California, and Connecticut, made it into C or C- territory. Based on this analysis, it looks like everyone has a lot of room for improvement. So state to state, the game might look pretty similar, but every legislature is playing with a different number of pieces and their own house rules. So apart from tracking depressing statistics like federal corruption charges, how can we judge how well our state's particular blend is serving us? To answer that question, we're going to have to go back to 1619, where it all began. Just trust me. On the next episode, we're going to keep the Legis love going here with a look back at the history of state legislatures. It's going to be 1 part Doctor Who, 1 part Bill and Ted, and several parts Colonial Williamsburg. For now, thanks for listening and for being an above-average citizen.